Hi everyone, welcome to EDSE 607, Literacy Development and Interventions. My name is Amy Zeidler. I am an adjunct professor for St. Mary's University in the Masters of Special Education program. I also work in the Reading Licensure program. And one of the first activities we're going to work on this first week is looking at assessing students. Your first assignment is also your task stream item, so I wanted to make sure we cover this information really well, so you can do that assignment very well. So in this course, we start on the topic of assessments because, of course, you have to see if students qualify for special education services. But also, if they end up qualifying, they're going to end up in your program, and you have to know what to teach them and what interventions to provide. So in this course, it isn't just about qualifying students and that kind of assessments, but then you also need to know what to do with them and how to get them to grow in the areas of reading. When teaching reading to students with disabilities, you're going to start with assessment. So that's where we are this first week. We're going to start by looking here kind of at the basics, and what we all know as educators basically is we use our assessments to qualify students for special education services. There on this slide just lists a few different types of assessments that you're going to use. But you're going to notice there's a difference there between general achievement tests and diagnostic tests. Your textbook is going to explain those two in a little bit more detail. But assessments that you use to qualify students for special education services have to be standardized. They are almost always norm referenced. You might have a few criterion reference things, but typically we're looking at a norm reference that's going to provide you with a percentile ranking so you can see where students fall to categorize their performance as being a deficit or disability. So the different assessments to qualify for students for special education services can be just a little bit different than some other categories. When we look at either qualifying a student for special education or either at looking at intervention or instruction, we want to have assessments that can also show you how students compare to their same age peers. And why would you do this? Well, in Minnesota, which is where we are, typically a student that's 2 grade levels behind should be considered for a learning disability. So you need to see to what extent their deficit is, how profound or not. So when we look at this list, we need to be able to compare students to a large sample of students at their same age. When you use percentiles, you can see if a student is at the 15th percentile. Of course, we're talking about a severe deficit. This is most likely going to be in the disability category. Just the definitions between, or the difference between norm referenced versus criterion referenced. You could use either type of test, but norm reference is going to give you a comparison like a percentile ranking, so you can compare students to students, whereas the criterion reference test would give you a level of mastery. So what pieces of information do you want students to have mastered by a certain point? You can use standardized tests. They don't always have to be, but you just want something that is going to be able to show how a student at the same age performs somewhere. Those tests can be formal, informal, or curriculum-based assessments, and we'll have a little bit more on that category near the end here. Assessments to determine classroom performance is another category that you're going to be looking at. Why would you need to know that? Well, again, how profound is the student's deficit in reading? You want to look at what types of things does the student struggle with that are not typical of a normal achieving student. These are the things that help you not only to decide to qualify a student for special education services, but it can also give you clues as to what parts of reading are difficult. What parts of reading are you going to have to provide intervention or instruction in? So when we look at these two categories here, a CBM or a CBA, the difference is just curriculum-based measure or a curriculum-based assessment, same thing. Depends on where you're at or what website you might be on determines which one is which. But a CBA is the same procedure given to all students of a particular group, typically of a grade or a class. The materials are often found in the current curriculum that you're working with, and they are often a fluency measure or a comprehension measure. In fact, if you say CBA to me, I'm assuming that you're talking about fluency unless you specify something otherwise. And by fluency, I'm saying oral reading proficiency or oral reading fluency, ORF, depending on what program you might be using. And that is simply a 1-minute timing. You have students read a certain grade level of text. You count the miscues as they read, and you subtract them from the total, and that tells you how many words per minute they can read. Then you can look at different fluency benchmarking methods. For instance, the Hasbrook and Tyndall has a fluency guide for like what grade level students should be at, or how many words per minute a student should be reading at each grade level. Another CBA or type of CBA could be a chapter or unit test from the student's curriculum. So if you're looking at a student in your classroom and they're being referred for special ed, I can look at their chapter tests and see how they're performing in comparison to the rest of the class, or even just looking at what pieces they're missing. This can help me either guide their instruction or see that they're profoundly behind their peers. Another category of assessments is to determine their reading levels to plan instruction. So now, of course, we're not even talking about qualifying a student for special ed, but you also have to know assessments that are going to help you plan instruction for a student once they're in your program. What do they need to learn? What are their specific areas of deficit that need instruction or intervention? So things to consider when giving assessments to plan instruction is, can the student read the materials in their own classroom? If you are looking at a learning disabled student and they're just like a partial pullout, you see them for a part of their day and then the rest of the day they're in the regular programming, can they handle that? And what kind of support are they going to need in order to be in a situation like that? And if they're not able to handle that, then what kinds of materials, what kind of a program, what kind of a system are you going to set up for them so that they can grow and overcome their disability? You need assessments that are going to show you an instructional level, so you can teach the student how to read. It's important to keep the student at an instructional level. That's where the cutting edge of learning is going to be. If a student is reading material that is too difficult, they're not going to be able to grow. If the student is reading independently, that's great. They're going to grow their vocabulary, but they're not going to grow their reading level as much as they would if you're teaching them at their instructional level. And more to come on that in a few weeks when we start looking at the QRI-6. These different types of assessments can be CBAs. They can be an informal reading inventory that will tell you, you can measure their fluency and comprehension and see how they compare to students in their grade, or to students that you're already working with, to be able to partner students together. It states fluency and comprehension. You're also going to have to be giving interventions, which in the next slide we'll talk about that, in the other areas of reading. Once again, these types of assessments are going to be more on the side of being informal, or CBAs, or teacher-created materials. So overall, looking at a student's entire reading profile. So a student's already qualified. Now I got to know, do I have to teach them phonological awareness? If some of the assessments that you gave to qualify a student did not include those pieces, you're going to need to figure that out. Because if phonological awareness is the root issue, you have to provide instruction in that area, or a student's not going to grow. Not to say that reading is a continuum, but each of these build on each other. So if a student doesn't have phonological awareness, by the time a student gets to having to be able to read fluently when he comes across multisyllabic words, that's going to break down, and his accuracy is going to break down, and then his comprehension is going to break down. So that points back to that phonological awareness piece. So you need an assessment that shows you which particular areas are a struggle, are the biggest struggle, and then where you're going to, so then you can target where your instruction is going to fall. So we've talked about different types of assessments in each of these categories, but a formal assessment would be something familiar, or something similar to like the Woodcock-Johnson or the Gates-McGinnity or other assessments in that category. They're big, expensive tests. There's been lots of studies done on them. Students from across the country have been giving them, so there's a large norming sample. That would be considered a formal assessment. An informal assessment is something like the QRI-6, or if any of your programs use stuff out of the University of Minnesota like PRESS, or some maybe just private companies, those would be more informal assessments. A teacher-constructed assessment is just as good, or can be just as good, to help you plan instruction as some of the big box type of assessments. So it just depends on what is your purpose for assessing. So you could be looking at a teacher-constructed assessment as well. And then, of course, we've talked about CBAs. So that's materials that have come from your curriculum. Okay, so this is a big one and can be tricky to understand. So if you have to replay this a couple times, please feel free. But assessment reliability is very important when you're looking at what is the purpose for assessing. So it's a necessary topic because you have different purposes. So if you're going to qualify a student for special ed services and change the way their instruction is given, and their instruction must be given by law and federal dollars are at stake, that assessment had be pretty awfully reliable. So let's just talk about the definition of reliability to start with. Reliability is the degree to which an assessment tool produces stable and consistent results. So the different types of reliability, for example, like a test-retest reliability. Could a student get the same or a similar test score if they are tested again 6 weeks or more later? There's the test alternate test. So if you give a student one test and then you give them the alternate version of the test, those scores should be similar. So like I was saying earlier, big box companies, they have to have done these studies to prove that they are a reliable assessment. And that's how we can make the decision to be able to change the way a student is receiving their services. Like I stated earlier, if a student is going to receive different services than what they typically would receive, i.e. special education services, their educational materials is going to be presented a different way than anybody else has access to, that has to be a reliability of 0.90. So that means they have to be able to get that same score on that test. I know it's not a percent, but if you think about it that way, it kind of helps you frame it in your mind. They have to be able to get that same score 90% of the time. Or there's a 0.9 variation in the score that they get. That's one way to think about it too. I'm not a math teacher, so please forgive me, but at least if you can keep these categories in your head, that'll help you think about what kinds of tests you need for what types of assessment situations. The second category there, and is not as common, there's few assessments that actually fall into this category, that is a 0.80 reliability. When you're looking at assessments that are going to help you make decisions about class placement, for instance, like your MCA tests or your MAP tests, those, I know in our district, when we look at gifted and high potential programming, we look at the Lexile scores for students in those types of assessments. So those assessments have to have a 0.80 reliability. And then when you're looking at screening type tools, that has to be, or that is going to fall in the 0.70 category. That means, we're getting a little less, we're getting farther away from being accurate or getting the same score each time a student tests. So if you think about fluency measurements, if any of you give Dibbles assessments or Ames Web or the FAST or a CBM in your classroom where you're measuring oral reading fluency, the chances of a student scoring the exact number or close to the same number are not that great. I mean, they can get close, but not at 0.90. 0.70 is what those are. Those types of assessments aren't going to qualify a student for special ed services, but they're going to show you that, for instance, in third grade, if a student is supposed to be reading 100 words per minute, but the student is reading 50, we know that there's a severe deficit in fluency, and we need to do some further diagnostics to see either what we need to plan for instruction or as part of a special ed qualification. The other category, it's not mentioned on this slide, is an NA. So there are going to be assessments like something a teacher created type assessment that's not going to have reliability on it. There's nobody that's going to sit down and do a reliability study or come up with the statistics on a first grade teacher who gives a sight word assessment to all of her students to see how well the students did. So things like that do not actually have a reliability, and that would be something that would be considered NA. So these are some things to think about when you're looking at assessments. Thanks for joining me today.